Hello and welcome to another episode of Weekends. I am your host, Nando Vila. It is Memorial Day, so my regular co-host, Anna Kasparian, is off today, which means producer Cale Brooks, you got your big shot.
Yeah.
Well, this is your big opportunity. You're stepping in front of the camera, see your beautiful face. But I mean, all I got to say is just don't fuck it up, dude. This is your big shot.
Yeah.
Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime.
I'm totally fine right now. It's gonna work out. I have good takes. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, we got a great show for you guys today. We're going to talk about wokeness and how we love it, and we're going to talk about Chile with René Rojas because it's pretty remarkable what's going on there right now. I think you can safely say maybe it's the end of an era in Chile, or maybe the beginning of the end of an era, if that makes sense.
It's kind of our two topics are just so kind of splits of this moment in neoliberalism of, like, on the one hand, just like kind of what liberalism has become in America and a lot of the world, and just like kind of how far the left is from kind of being at the heart of like our zeitgeist right now. That it's just redounded into like just the dumbest shit. But as we were saying, and we'll get to, it hits everyone, so it's not just, we have to deal with wokeness, but so does the ruling class, so do all of their minions up at top. But then in Chile, it's like the exact opposite, where like there's this like inkling of like what a better future could be. And it's still very far from it, but like, God, it's night and day with like where the U.S. is and where so much of the left is right now globally.
No, absolutely. And, in order to capture the left zeitgeist, you need to read books, specifically Verso's books.
That's right.
You know what time it is. It's time for the Verso ad read, baby. You can join the Verso book club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more books in the mail. All Verso book club members will also get 50% off everything on the website, including the Verso Comrade tote bag, for as long as you are a subscriber. Each member tier is 50% off for your first 3 months. The Comrade tier is only $20 a month, and if you join in May, you'll get these 4 books: The Last Man Takes LSD, Foucault, and the End of Revolution by Mitchell Dean and Daniel Zamora. I saw that Corey Robin was tweeting about that book today, and I was like, I know that from the Verso ad read. White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism by Andreas Baum and the Zetkin Collective. Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization by Rodrigo Nunes. And Edward Said, His Thought as a Novel by Dominique Ede. Yeah, Cale.
Yeah, read them. Read those books. Those are good books. Verso is good books.
How many books do you read a month?
A month? I've been trying to get on a regiment of like a book a week, and sometimes I slip. In fact, very often I slip, and then I'll make up with it in other weeks. But I do probably end up reading. I do end up read a lot of Verso books that just
nice.
I mean, it is like it's they do have some of the like kind of the quintessential, not just of like this moment, like how to understand our moment politically from really intelligent people on the left, but they have a good back catalog too. So just shouting them out.
I think I'm reading one of their back catalogs right now. I'm reading a biography of John Reed, the American journalist who went to cover the October Revolution in 1917.
Mm-hmm.
They made a movie about him called Reds, written, starring, and directed by Warren Beatty, which is very good. Highly recommend it. And I'm reading about his life. And he was an interesting guy. He went to the Mexican Revolution. He saw two revolutions, Mexican Revolution and Russian Revolution. I was like, how many of us get to see one revolution? He got to see two.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I've been reading a lot of, I've been reading a bunch of different things, but some of it, I've been reading some, some people from back then. I was reading some Rosa Luxemburg the other day because some DSA meeting wants me to. But it's just like, it is really fascinating because it's like 100 years ago. Like there's people who are alive today, who are 100 years old, it's really not that far off. And yet like, it was like the stakes of what they were doing were so much more like monumental. I mean, but just like it took decades of the left to build power, but like the situations they were in, it's like hard to fathom given our situation right now.
Well, they had a chance of taking power. They were actually like considering what to do with it. Once they took it, that was the debate at the time. Now we're just like, man, I wonder what that would be like. But yeah, I just love the idea of a DSA meeting be like, Kale needs to read this book. Kale needs to read this book. They're just like, begging you to read a book, and you're like, fine, I'll read it for you guys and explain it back to you.
It's like there's like the Simpsons meme where the whole class is like, Bart, say the word. It's just read the Luxembourg.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? Should I do my decode?
Let's decode it up. Nando, I can't wait to hear your decode.
Smooth transition. Okay. Well, this week we got some breaking news because we learned that Lockheed Martin, the largest weapons manufacturer in the world, is woke. That's right. It turns out that Lockheed Martin has been implementing a program which sent white male executives to a 3-day diversity training program aimed at deconstructing their white male culture and encouraging them to atone for their white male privilege. Now, the details of this are incredibly funny, but before we get into it, it's worth understanding what exactly Lockheed Martin is.
Lockheed Martin is the top-grossing defense firm in the world, and the U.S. government supports that business to the tune of over $37.7 billion. It surpasses its closest competitors, Boeing and Raytheon, by nearly $20 billion in arms sales. These funds are granted by Congress to provide equipment that enables the U.S. military to protect the country at home and abroad.
So yeah, Lockheed Martin are literally merchants of death, specifically the biggest merchants of deaths in the world. And their latest killing technology, lasers.
At Lockheed Martin, we know combat aircraft. We know how to integrate and manufacture tactical pods that perform in harsh environments. And when it comes to laser weapon systems, we're proving ourselves in the lab and in the field, from detect to defeat, all the way down the kill chain. So when our customers are ready to roll, we're right there with them.
From detect to defeat, all the way down the kill chain, baby. You love to see it. So yeah, Lockheed Martin get rich off of selling weapons to the American empire and its client states in order to murder people around the world. And I don't have to remind you that the vast majority of the victims of the American empire are black and brown. But at least there will be no manspreading at the office. So let's look at some of these details of this cultural revolution within Lockheed Martin. The seminars were led by something called White Men as Full Diversity Partners, which have been doing these things since 1997. The program included, quote, a former 3-star general and the vice president of production for the $1.7 trillion F-35 fighter jet program. That's the funniest thing I've ever heard. And to begin, the diversity trainers led a free association exercise asking the Lockheed employees to list connotations for the term white man. The trainers wrote down old, racist, privileged, anti-women, angry, Aryan nation, KKK, founding fathers, guns, guilty, and my personal favorite, can't jump. Now it continues. White Men as Full Diversity Partners argues that the roots of white male culture include traits such as rugged individualism, a can-do attitude, hard work, operating from principles, and striving towards success, which are, quote, devastating to women and minorities. Now, I don't know about you, but A can-do attitude and valuing hard work are traits that are praised in many different cultures, not just the so-called white culture. I don't know, I've seen plenty of samurai movies. They seem to praise those traits. So anyway, this information was uncovered by a guy named Chris Rufo, who is an anti-critical race theory activist and reporter. He went on Tucker Carlson to explain why he thinks this is all really bad.
Chris Rufo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributor to City Journal. He broke this story. He joins us now to tell us what this training session was like. Chris, thanks so much for coming on and for your reporting. What went on at this thing?
Well, this is a long-standing training program. Actually, 8,000 Lockheed Martin executives and employees have been through race re-education programs. And this one was particularly galling. They had these executives go through these exercises where they said that being a white male was analogous to being a KKK member, to being in the Aryan Nation. They also said that, kind of funny way, white men can't jump, and all of these slurs and stereotypes about their own origins. And they take it through a series of exercises where they had to review 156 white male privilege statements, apologizing for their race, apologizing for their sex, apologizing for their orientation. And the question is this: if a 3-star general retired in the United States military can't stand up to a bunch of crackpot diversity trainers, how on earth are we going to stand up to communist China?
I mean, that's really what it is, right? Like, how are we going to stand up to those dastardly Chinese if all we're doing is checking our privilege all day? Am I right? Now, obviously, Chris is a right-winger, and that's why he hates all of this. But that does not mean that all of this is good in any way. For starters, this stuff doesn't even work on its own terms. According to a piece by the Jacobin show's very own Jen Pan in the New Republic, quote, despite the rapid growth, today's diversity industry has largely failed to usher in the diverse workplaces and schools it promises. A growing number of empirical studies suggest that anti-bias training, also known as implicit bias training, and other diversity initiatives don't work. A recent study by sociologists Frank Dubin at Harvard University and Alexandra Kalev at Tel Aviv University, surveying more than 30 years of data collected from over 800 firms, found that diversity programs not only failed to increase workplace diversity, but in many cases even reduced diversity or exacerbated participants' biases. A 2016 meta-analysis of nearly 500 studies on implicit bias interventions similarly found that while such sessions sometimes briefly and slightly diminished participants' implicit biases, they had no significant long-term effects on people's behavior or attitudes. And in 2019, another study of diversity training programs by a team of behavioral scientists further confirmed that one-time interventions designed to reduce implicit bias, the type used by the vast majority of employers and institutions, tend not to change very many minds at all. Now, you would think this would stop the diversity consultant industry, but it has not. Diversity consultants like white men as full diversity partners, and more famously, Robin DiAngelo of White Fragility fame, charge huge amounts of money from corporations to hold these seminars. The question is, why? If it doesn't work, why are they spending all this money? Well, Bhaskar Sunkara points out that these training sessions are a great way to inoculate corporations from lawsuits in the future. He writes in The Guardian, quote, it's not a coincidence that corporate human resources departments love to contact diversity consultants like DiAngelo to do anti-bias trainings. Trainings more than pay for themselves if they can demonstrate a commitment to an inclusive workplace in the event of later anti-discrimination lawsuits. They're also a lot cheaper than paying workers better and addressing structural inequalities. The more that blame for discrimination can be shifted onto individual racist Karens, the less onus there is on powerful corporations and the politicians who defend them to make real changes. And that is, of course, true. But beyond that, the fact that these diversity trainings fail on their own terms and that they don't actually reduce racial bias and that they are a convenient way for corporations to protect themselves using a sort of woke sheen, there's actually something even more insidious going on here. And that is that the whole entire woke project is a form of class warfare. It started out in academia, where it gained a sort of radical cachet. Then it became dominant in the media. And it has since been absorbed by basically every major corporation in America, including Lockheed Martin, the largest weapons manufacturer in the world. Now, that should give everyone a little bit of pause. If a set of values, cultural language, and ideology that are, in theory, meant to institute radical change are easily absorbed by the structures of power, then it was really never a threat from the beginning. and in fact is a useful tool for those in power. There are hilarious examples of people using wokeness for repressive ends, such as the time white gentrifiers in Austin called the cops on Black and Latino car clubs that have gathered in local parks for decades, labeling them a, quote, toxic display of masculinity. And there are studies that show that anti-racist training actually exacerbate classism. Quote, a recent paper published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General suggests that the idea of white privilege may have an unexpected drawback. It can reduce empathy for white people who are struggling with poverty. The paper finds that social liberals, people who have socially liberal views on the major political issues, are actually less likely to empathize with a poor white person's plight after being given a reading on white privilege. Seeing the world through a race reductionist lens is very useful for capital because it is completely antithetical to solidarity. If you're constantly emphasizing people's differences, it's harder to build the kind of cross-racial solidarity that can really threaten capital. And beyond that, the whole concept of a white culture is dubious at best. And when you keep reinforcing the idea that there is such a thing as white culture and that it has all these inherently nefarious things, a lot of people who didn't choose to be born white are going to say, fuck it, maybe they're right. I'm proud of my white culture. Maybe we should, I don't know, preserve it or purify it. You know, historically, that's been a very dicey proposition. And the basic idea that you should judge people for the content of their character, not the color of their skin, is broadly popular and both strategically and morally correct. But when you just look at someone superficially, you are able to judge them based on superficial factors, like take the admiration of Nelson Mandela by basically every major Western leader. Barack Obama, for example, was obsessed with Mandela. But were they really listening to Mandela, or were they just attracted to the sort of idea of a Mandela or the image of Mandela? Take, for example, Michael Welp, who is one of the founders of the White Men as Full Diversity Partners, the guy who led the white privilege training at Lockheed Martin. He spoke of his admiration for Mandela in a TED Talk about whiteness.
3 years before Nelson Mandela died, I wrote him a letter. In it, I said, I was astonished to see you emerge from 27 years in prison and embrace, from a place of love, the white men who imprisoned you. You showed that love is the greatest force for change. And I want you to know that it's the same thread of love that I carry that you passed on to the white men in South Africa.
That's inspiring stuff, no doubt. But I wonder what Mandela would have thought about Michael Welp selling himself to the war profiteers who helped oppress his people in South Africa. Did his whiteness prevent him from listening to Mandela's actual words?
If there is a country that has committed unspeakable atrocities in the world, it is the United States of America. They don't care. They don't care for human beings. 57 years ago, when Japan was retreating on all fronts, they decided to drop the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Killed a lot of innocent people who are still suffering from the effects of those bombs. Those bombs were not aimed against the Japanese. They were aimed against the Soviet Union to say, look, this is the power that we have. If you dare oppose what we do, this is what is going to happen to you. Because they are so arrogant, they decided to kill innocent people in Japan who are still suffering from that. Who are they now to pretend that they are the policemen of the world?
I wonder if Michael Welp had gotten his hands on Harry Truman, he wouldn't have, he would have checked his own white privilege and just realized, oh my God, those Japanese, they're POC. Maybe we shouldn't drop the bomb on them.
Yeah, that's the if only diversity trainings could have been around in the 40s. Maybe like. Because, in the moment when, we had actual Jim Crow, if only we could have, taught people to diversify their workplace and their, gotten rid of their bad racist beliefs. I mean, the thing is, like, and this isn't my original, comment on this, but like, I think it's very likely that a lot of corporations will see diversity trainers and diversity specialists and experts as like the new HR mechanism, because you don't really need an HR person if like if what you're focused on is like disciplining your workers. When you can bring someone in that does a training and says, admit you're a racist, tell us all the times you did racist things, you had bad racist thoughts. And then when it comes time to, when the boss says, I don't really like this person, they should either like speed up or get out. And then they have, they could come back to them and say, well, I heard you're racist. You told us yourself.
Yeah. You said the N-word when you were rapping along to a Jay-Z song when you were in high school, like you're going to get fired over that.
Yeah. I think it's just like all of this wokeness stuff. I mean, like you said, I mean, I think you summarized it really wonderfully, but like it's starts in the academy. It starts in academia with like basically the end of the 60s generation. You get all these people that move into academia for the first time. And now you have this explosion of ethnic studies and cultural studies. And some of it, of course, is good, but a lot of it just ends up, it exists in that world where like you have to find your own lane, and then you become the spokesperson for a particular set of ideas, and then you get very territorial over it. And then there's a ton of stuff. It's just like so much of like what ends up getting produced is just gibberish, because it is all the identity with none of the class politics. And then what we're seeing now is that like it's just been so easily incorporated into the corporate world as like a means of disciplining and of a sorting mechanism. Like not only do you need to have the correct degree, but you need to have the correct woke worldview in order to be hired here. And it helps them, like you're saying, it helps them with now they don't have to worry about if there's going to be some race-related scandal or something, because they have disciplined already, and then they have further disciplining measures to say, oh, we'll just get rid of them if something happens, because we have them on tape basically saying that they have bad thoughts in their head.
Did you see the story that came out in the New York Times this week about the woman who pretended to be a Cherokee for decades? She was an icon of what they called Native American feminism, and was like one of the biggest she was one of the leaders in the early 90s of the movement that many Native Americans were involved in, that was kind of like against the pretendians, what they call the pretendians, like the Elizabeth Warrens of the world.
Right.
And she was, yeah, but she was one of like the leaders of that movement, like quote unquote, found her voice in that movement when she herself was a pretend Indian. And it's just like the whole reading through that whole story. I mean, you see just the sort of hard limits of that kind of worldview, that it really it creates, first of all, these kind of weird incentives in which we're seeing tons of academics like pretending to be the member of some oppressed minority, which is just a bizarre kind of quirk of whatever state of society we're in. And but beyond that, it just like it creates this culture of like, in order to speak about something or to think about something or to care about something, you have to be of the thing, which is it's just antithetical to any kind of cross racial solidarity. I mean, they would never say that. They would say like, no, it's totally possible. But like in actual practice, it's impossible, because
right.
you start to sort people into different groups rather than to sort of bring people together. And there's no point in kind of like denying, that there's like cultural differences and things like that.
Right.
There's no one is like, here to say that we should deny those things. But like, honestly, like the sort of basic, like this is like cheesy and sappy to say, but the basic kind of Martin Luther King framework of things, that seems to me the right way of doing it. Like we don't like negate any sort of particular kind of oppression, but like our strategy to overcome it is to build as broad a base as possible and to judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I don't know. It just sounds like, it's like, yeah, man, that sounds like people can get on board with that to me.
Right. Well, the question is, it's like, do these cultural differences go all the way down to to your very essence as a human being? And the left has historically, up until the last 30 years, been very clear in saying, no, not at all. There is something that binds us all together. There is some kind of common humanity. And that's part of it's an inherently it's inherent to our theory of advancing into some better future, whatever, if we want to call it socialism or something else, that we actually do think that people have the capacity to sympathize and empathize, to actually have a humanitarian ethos, that we can take care of one another, that we despite languages and cultural differences, different traditional practices, that we at our core actually have so much more in common. And then what we end up saying is that the political practice that we come up with in order to get to that better world ends up being on material grounds, on class grounds, because we say that ultimately the working class and their interests are going to end up being the interests of the vast majority of most people. They are the most people. And so by pursuing their interests, we end up pursuing a universalistic politics where we say that every single person should have certain aspects of their life guaranteed, certain true human rights, not in kind of the foreign policy human rights terminology, but true human, the fact that you're a human being, you have inherent value and worth, and you deserve certain things. But there's also, actually, I want to pull one more thing into this because like you're saying, I mean, this is politically really bad too. And we actually have data on this, that Jared Abbott, friend of the show, although I don't think he's actually ever been on the show, but he's been on the channel. He co-authored.
I've cited him extensively in Decodes for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So friend of the show.
Yes.
And he wrote a review piece that came out a couple months ago. There was a book by Seth Maskett rather, called Learning from Loss. And it's just a lot of empirical data trying to understand the 2020 Democratic primary electorate. And, why did they end up ultimately going with Biden? Did Bernie have a shot just based on the actual voters themselves, and the thing is that I'm going to pull up this quote because he says that there is substantial evidence, and he's quoting Seth, but he's citing evidence by Andrew B. Hall, or empirical research rather, but there's substantial evidence that candidates perceived by voters as being extreme tend to underperform candidates perceived as moderate, but it is less clear how voters' perceptions of extremism vary across different policy positions and message framings offered by candidates. And he goes on to say that, for instance, the results of Maskett survey experiments suggest that many voters perceive progressive policies aimed at addressing group-based inequalities as being more extreme than, say, a non-group-based policy to increase high-paying jobs through economic growth and subsequently punish candidates who hold the more progressive positions. Basically saying, for whatever reason, right or wrong, people perceive race-specific or means-tested programs that are really specific, both in content and in rhetoric, being aimed at particular communities as more extreme, and it's punished politically. So not only are universal programs morally more right, it's right to take care of everyone, because we do believe that every single person has certain human value and worth. It's also politically more viable, and so this is what the left should be considering moving forward, and should be running on these kinds of programs and these kinds of policies that are universal, that just say, we're going to raise your wage and give you some healthcare. You need those.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, when it's this kind of thing is not just limited to white people.
Right.
Often working class Mexican Americans and things like that, they don't like to be judged for being Mexican, even if it's in a positive way, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? They don't want to be seen as oppressed or something because they're Mexican American or whatever. This is very common, and again, policies that and political kind of strategy that kind of ties people together and kind of makes them feel like they're part of a shared thing with other people in the country, like that just like appeals to people. Like no one wants to be like isolated from the rest of them, you know, like that just doesn't, that's just in their bones. I think people feel that way. I don't know, like it's been such a strange thing and to witness, because, you know, I think Biden, who kind of is, you know, an awful human being and all that stuff, but he comes from like an old school Democratic Party. Like he was around before the Democratic Party, like just barely, but before the Democratic Party really turned, you know, full neoliberal and you know, DLC and all that stuff. He kind of remembers the old hands that used to kind of dominate American politics, the sort of New Deal Democrats that used to just utterly dominate. And so like he has a lot of that rhetorical training, or at least like a faint memory of it, and he uses it to great effect. Like, I don't know, like when, you know, reporters will ask him, I was like, do you think like, you know, all of Trump voters are racist, which is like a classic kind of liberal debate, you know? He's like, I don't think so. I mean, I think most people are good people, you know, like, and we're trying to like, and that's just the right strategy to move forward and to try to build something better and to just win. Because if you start trying to tell people like that they're bad, like that is not going to work. And it's been wild to see awful people like the Clintons, for example, kind of be able to rebrand themselves as woke.
Right.
Like, of all people, the Clintons, come on. Like, you know, we know these people. They have a track record. It's the opposite of what wokeness like purports to care about.
Right. Well, the question is ultimately like, what is your political goal? Like, I want a world where we have Medicare for all. And I think the way that you're going to get to that is through massive, broad coalitions, primarily rooted in working people, but like as many middle-class people who will get on board. If we can get some elites, great, but that's not the target. The point is that like we need a massive, broad base if we're going to be able to take on like the most powerful ruling class in human history. Like even just having the base is not going to be enough to win that fight, of course. Like it's a prerequisite. Yeah.
Gives you a prayer to fight. Yeah.
But then all of this stuff, like just all of these, like like no one wants to feel like a token. No one wants to be stereotyped. Like no one wants to feel like they're like not like an equal human being. But it's just these middle class people. It's people that are in professional settings that can use it as like a bargaining chip as they're trying to move up in the world. And it's academic stuff, and then we all end up dealing with the consequences of that.
The funniest thing happened to me, Kale, like it was last week or 2 weeks ago. I got approached. I got a call from a headhunter, an executive search person, for a job that I'm like wildly unqualified for, like comically unqualified for, you know, like CEO of a big prestigious media organization, you know, that you've heard of. And I was like, I took the call, obviously, just mostly out of curiosity, but I was like, well, you know, like, why wouldn't you? And I'm talking to this person, and I was like, I gotta be honest, like, I'm surprised you guys are reaching out to me for this job. And she's like, well, we had you on a list of Latinx media executives, and you know, we just really want to focus on, you know, diversity, and we're really like committed to, you know, blah blah blah.
And I was like, wait. Latinx.
Well, no, I didn't correct her in that way. I said, listen, you know, I appreciate that, but you're going to get me and yourself in trouble. You know, I don't want to pull an Elizabeth Warren because I am not Latinx. You are more Latinx than I am as an Argentine American. People don't know about that. But you're more Latinx than I am. I am a colonizer imperialist from Spain. You know, I am not part of the Latinx thing. And she was like, oh my God, like, I'm so sorry. Like, as if she offended me. And I'm like, no, like, not that either. But I'm just like, you know, trying to help you out. And she's like, okay, can you explain that to me? And like, I had to like explain it to her. And she was like, you know, this well-meaning, like, she honestly like meant well. Like, and she had like a sort of genuine commitment to, you know, she's like, I think it's good that we're trying to uplift, you know, minorities and people of color or whatever. And like, I just like her referencing me as a person of color. Like, I was like, you're going to get in trouble. Like, you're going to get in trouble. Like, if this,
that conversation ended with you going, yeah, and I'll follow up with the Adolph Reed article in the email. Don't worry.
Right. Yeah, I already said that to her. No, but it was funny. I mean, it was just like a funny thing. Like, but that was why I was being considered for the job, is for the supposed color of my skin. You know, even though she was on the phone, like she couldn't see me or anything like that. But I thought it was kind of funny, that just a very thing of this time. But yeah.
Well, speaking of Latink, I can pull in our guest who happens to be from the Southern Hemisphere.
Absolutely.
We are. I guess I'll intro you. We are joined by René Rojas, who is a sociologist who teaches at Binghamton University. He has been researching the development of neoliberalism in Latin America for seems like forever. I believe there's maybe a book in the works that may kind of culminate some of this, and very much looking forward to reading that. He's also he spent many years as a activist in Chile, and he is also on the editorial board of Catalyst. So welcome, René.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you guys. Just a slight correction. Most of my political work or activist work in Latin America was not in Chile. It was mostly in Mexico, actually, and 1 year in Guatemala. So,
damn, you're calling me out as a fake friend right now.
Get the facts straight, Kale. You fake news. You know, the lying fake news media.
Well, it's, as you guys were speaking, it's all one big monolithic category anyway. Yeah,
it's Mexico, Chile, same shit, right? You guys are all just Latinx down there, right? That's
something like that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we want the Latinx experience. We want to hear just what's going on in the continent, I suppose.
Yeah, what's going on? What's going on in Chile? Explain to us what's going on there. What the hell's going on?
Wow. A lot is going on, and I imagine you're referring specifically to the latest elections, which were held about a week and a half ago. These elections were, received most attention because Chileans were electing delegates to a constituent assembly, right, that will redraft the country's constitution. But there were also local and gubernatorial elections. For the first time, there were provincial elections in Chile. But of course, most of the attention has been paid, correctly so, to the outcome of the constituent elections and the very fact that these elections were held in the first place. And the best way to describe what occurred is it's a veritable earthquake. That has shattered, really, the foundations of the old political regime in Chile. This is the regime that emerged out of the dictatorship and the transition, the post-authoritarian transition that occurred in 88, 89, and that ruled over Chile ever since, primarily, under center-left governments. So what these elections have done essentially has been to shatter, right, the old partisan system, the old political system, and open for the first time, in over 4 decades, the possibility of more substantive democratic reform in the country.
Mark Fisher talks about the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile as the sort of opening salvo of the neoliberal era, like that. It's like where the neoliberalism kind of begins, a good place to kind of start it officially. And Chile, for many decades, like in places like The Economist magazine and whatever, has been held up as a kind of model of a free market economy and just how well everything goes there. It's like a decent place to live and the thing, and woohoo, great job. Is that picture an accurate one, that the sort of free market reforms that Chile is famous for, does that create a really decent, healthy society where everyone is just happy?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because that's fundamentally what was at play here, what was in question during these elections, and not just this round of elections. I mean, Chile has been going through a cycle of mass mobilization and rejection of this model, right, for about the past 10 years. And it really, really intensified and exploded in October of 2019. But going back to your question, right? Chile's been celebrated, as the poster child of neoliberalism. I think precisely because it allegedly combined two things that we all love, right? Prosperity and democracy. And there's some truth actually to both of those assessments, but they're just wildly incomplete. In terms of prosperity, Chile received this attention as the miracle, the South American miracle. In the 90s, Chileans took to calling ourselves los jaguares del Pacífico, the jaguars of the Pacific, because Chile did experience, very, very robust growth rates from beginning of the late 80s under the dictatorship into the 2000s. Averaging about 5% yearly growth rates, with some years hitting, up to 8, 9, 10%. The result of that was an overall increase in living standards, and you can measure that by just looking at GDP per capita, which for formerly poor country, now an OECD country, right, reached about $17,000 per year. So on paper, it looked like the model had in fact delivered prosperity across the board, because you had these, compared to the rest of Latin America, fairly spectacular looking, growth and per capita income rates. Of course, if you dig a little further, what you find is that Chile, by the same token, was characterized by just massive levels of inequality, and also huge levels of popular and social insecurity. There was a big chunk of the population that received very low wages, somewhere between 40 and 30%, or look at it the other way, 30 to 40% of Chileans continue to work in the informal market, so don't have secure employment, for income and to feed their families. And for many people, they had to assume risk on their own, risk in terms of getting healthcare, risk in terms of sending their kids to decent schools. And another thing that became a huge problem was the living conditions of elderly people, because pensions have been privatized, and about 70% of retired elderly workers in Chile make under half of the minimum wage. So they can't even, they can barely scrape by. So that's what was happening in terms of on the socioeconomic front. In terms of, political democracy, again, things weren't as rosy as The Economist, the New York Times, and many Chileans themselves, elite Chileans, try to paint the picture. Chile ended up, undeniably, of course, transitioned from a military dictatorship into a liberal democracy with, civil and political rights and free elections, and that's all something that needs to be recognized. But it ended up producing an oligarchic system in which two main coalitions, the center-right and the center-left, pretty much traded power. The dominant coalition was the center-left, originally called the Concertación, which was in power for 20 years straight. But they pretty much shared power and became the, as I said, oligarchs of the political system, making all policy decisions and excluding the vast majority of Chileans who felt alienated, who didn't feel represented. And you can get a picture of that kind of crisis of representation by looking at voter turnout rates. In the first democratic elections in Chile, 90%, talking about 89, 90% of registered voters came out to vote. By 2017, so after almost 30 years of this, under 40%, around 40% of the population was bothering to even vote. So, as even in the political realm, turned out to be not a very representative state, and that's what led to this massive crisis of legitimacy.
Right. To just follow up at that point, and I want to actually read something that you wrote in a recent Catalyst piece titled Chile's Democratic Revolution. So beyond just the voter turnout, Since 2002, the figure for those reporting scant or zero trust in ruling parties has hovered around 40% or higher. In other words, just over 10 years into the transition, the vast majority of Chileans, the same proportion that has now voted to rewrite the Constitution, had lost faith in all parties. And so I guess the question is effectively like, why? Why did they lose faith? And then maybe even more important for us, more concretely, why did for instance, working people lose faith in the left parties? That this is, we see these massive demonstrations over the last couple of years, and it's somewhat more of it's coming from working people. It's not coming from political parties. There's somewhat of a disconnect between the actions on the ground and the left institutionally and in party formation. So I'm curious what leads us to that situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I actually try to answer that question, which is quite complex, obviously, and it deals with, a long kind of span of time and a lot of factors going into it, I do want to highlight something that was embedded in your question. As I said earlier, the dominant force in Chilean post-authoritarian politics has been the center-left. The center-left in Chile includes the Socialist Party. Right, this is the party of Allende, of Salvador Allende, who was deposed in the 1973 coup. Right, this is the party that tried to make a democratic, Chilean road to real socialism. Right, and so many people might think that as the party of Allende, once it came to power, and it was it started off as the junior partner in the center-left coalition. The major partner were the Christian Democrats, but by 2000 it had really become the strongest party within the center-left coalition. And so one might ask, suspect that with the socialists in power, with Michelle Bachelet being elected twice, right, in power, this would be a pro-labor government. This would be a pro-working class and pro-poor government. And so I think it shocks many people to see just how thorough and deep the popular rejection of the Concertación has become. And the reason is that, in very, very simple terms, this was not a party of labor. This was not a party of the poor, as it had been under Allende. This was a neoliberal party dominated by elites, and that governed the party for elites, right? There's no way around that. Part of it is due to the manner in which the transition occurred, in which, in order to restore democracy, this new center-left political class had to agree to leave the basic rules of the game, the basic market rules of the game intact, right? But part of it is also because of how this party had refashioned itself, has transformed itself, and has deliberately, right, continued to fragment and weaken labor and popular sectors, and has instead woven very direct, very chummy ties with the country's business elite. And so that resulted in, all of the indicators that I listed in a somewhat disorganized fashion earlier on. That resulted, for instance, in privatized pensions and therefore no kind of real material security for elderly people in Chile. That resulted in the continuation of privatized healthcare, right? Where most Chileans don't have security when it comes to being insured or receiving proper healthcare. That resulted, for instance, in labor legislation that has been completely in favor of employers and has undermined the ability of workers to organize and to bargain collectively. The result of all of that has been a fractured society, right? Where with massive wealth accumulated at the top and massive material insecurity at the bottom.
I want to ask about this constitutional convention. I want to ask about the makeup of it and who are these people who are writing the Constitution? How do you write a Constitution? Do you just start writing? Seems like very difficult and complicated to get everyone to agree. I'm just like imagining what a constitutional convention would look like in this country, like in 2021, and it seems like it would be utter chaos. So, what is that process going to look like? What do you expect to be in it, and who is deciding what's in it?
Yeah, and even before I think answering this question, I should go back to something I said earlier. When I said that this new center or center-left political class, right, made a series of pacts as it negotiated the transition back to democracy, one of them was to inherit, as it were, the constitution that was imposed through corruption and coercion under Pinochet. So the constitution, which has governed Chile since the return to democracy, has been, the constitution imposed in 1980 by the military regime. And so that is the constitution which pretty much became the target of mass fury, mass resentment that exploded onto the streets in 2019, right, in this popular rebellion that lasted for weeks and that the regime could not put down through force. It could not contain. It could not. It found no ways of getting, young people and workers off the streets and keep them from rioting on the streets. And so, in November of 2019, the center-right government under Piñera, right, feeling this pressure from the street. I mean, Santiago was burning, and not just Santiago, but many towns and cities up and down the country. So at that point, it made this huge concession. It negotiated with all factions in parliament, including a new left that has emerged in Chile called the Frente Amplio, and agreed to hold a plebiscite in which Chileans were asked whether they wanted even to, a new constitution, and how the new constitution would be written. So as a result of that, in October of last year, right, 80% of Chileans voted to reject the old constitution and for a constituent assembly that would rewrite the constitution. Now, the elections to choose delegates to this assembly was postponed on a couple of occasions because of the pandemic. But now that it was held, the results are really not only fascinating, but quite shocking in the sense that they portend complete overhaul of Chile's political system. The two dominant coalitions, the center-right and the center-left, were just crushed. The center-right knew it would lose badly, and it was hoping to win a third of the votes so it could veto any major transformations. It only won 20% of the vote. The real loser, however, in the elections is the center-left, the old Concertación, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists primarily. And it stands to reason. They, as I said earlier, they have been the bulwark of the regime, of the post-authoritarian neoliberal regime. They simply got trounced. I think they got something like 14% of the vote. To give you an indication of the magnitude of their defeat, the Christian Democrats, which used to be the strongest party, right, in the 90s and into the early 2000s, they elected 2 delegates out of 155, just 2 delegates. I mean, it's just a major rejection and thrashing. And alongside of that defeat, of the defeat of those 2 regime forces, you see the emergence of new political forces. Primarily, and I think most encouraging, is the emergence of a coalition between the Communist Party, which had been totally relegated to the margins of Chilean politics up until very recently, a coalition between the communists and this new left force, the Frente Amplio. They came together, ran shared slates, and elected about 20% of the delegates, right? So did as well, if not better than the old ruling coalitions. And along with this new left bloc that has emerged, A number of independent slates and lists did quite well with them. Most encouraging of these is what's called the Lista del Pueblo, which is a series of fairly motley slates that social movements and grassroots organizations put together, and they received close to 15% of the vote. So these are the folks who are going to come together and within a year draft the new constitution. There are a number of rules that we might want to get into them if you want, right? But the interesting thing and the promising development again is that the old oligarchs, the old mainstays of the democratic neoliberal regime, are now minorities and have been tremendously weakened.
We should do the new rules. What are the new rules?
Well, I'm just going to mention a couple because they received a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. One actually had an ironic outcome. One of the rules that was put in place, both for putting together slates, list of candidates, and then for actually electing delegates, right, that will be drafting the Constitution, is the gender parity rule, right? At least half of candidates had to be women, and at least half of elected delegates, through whatever formula they had to be women as well. Turns out that I guess most political forces, even the right in Chile, has no problem fielding women candidates. And it turns out that men actually benefited from this rule more than women, because more women were elected than men. So to reach parity, some of the women had to be removed and men had to be raised.
It's about time. It's about damn time.
Well, I think it's interesting because, Chile has experienced over the last few years huge feminist mobilizations. At least that's how they're called, and they've had these massive days of demonstrations. We're up to, I think last year, up to 2 million women hit the streets. It was really impressive, right? And so there is a sense, right, that gender equality in a very, very sexist country, I mean, there's no way around that, right, has been forced onto the agenda. And it will, gender oppression, it has to be dealt with. What I find somewhat surprising, again, is that the parties from right to left, right, actually took this on fairly naturally. They didn't really have to. It wasn't a big imposition for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so we'll see how that plays out. Another similar thing is indigenous representation. There are, I think, 11 seats reserved for not just the Mapuche, which is the major kind of indigenous population in Chile, but all indigenous groups. And that's a good thing because, most of these communities and populations have been involved in local grassroots campaigns against multinational corporations, right, and have developed high levels of organization and programmatically, right, point toward, I think, and will be fighting for universalist demands for everyone. So I think the left and popular forces will definitely count on on working with them, can count on working with them. The other big and controversial rule, right, that came out of that November agreement between Piñera and most groups in parliament was that for big changes you need super majorities, right, to ratify these new elements of the Constitution. And so that meant that 1/3 of a bloc that controls only 1/3 of the delegates could veto, as I said earlier, major transformations. We'll see what happens. Things are in such flux right now, particularly for the two dominant old coalitions, right? That we'll have to keep an eye on, particularly the old concertacionistas, and in particular, I mentioned that the Christian Democrats, just they've really been relegated to the dustbin of Chile's political history. But the Socialist Party somehow, and I still don't quite understand why, they actually elected 14 representatives, 14 delegates. It's going to be very hard for them to, I think, band with the right. All the pressure from the street and from their own constituencies, to the extent that they still have any, right? Mass constituencies, will push them to ally with this new left and independent delegates to, vote in the types of basic legal foundations that the population really wants. And here, what we're talking about is not just political democratic rights, but social and economic rights as well.
Right. Well, so what's interesting both in that and whether it be the plebiscite or you mentioned kind of the feminist movement in Chile, so much of the actual political manifestations have come through people going to the streets, that it's been protest action. And it's something of a global phenomenon, obviously, that we just saw a year of protests around racial justice, Black Lives Matter in the U.S., but also kind of, regionally specific variants of that across the globe in all different countries. And I'm curious, because you have a critique of like maybe the limitations of protests, and I was wondering if we can get into that, because you have a quote. I want to read just one more quote from that same Catalyst piece that I brought up earlier, where you say that it was not realistic to think of toppling the government via unending street escalation, given the low levels of organization and strategic coordination that still hamper popular forces. While disruption on the streets and in workplaces certainly wrestled the promise of a plebiscite, it was only those at the highest echelons of state power who could have granted the concession. And in other work, you talk about the importance of mobilizational resources and structural leverage.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's the question is both specific to Chile, but in a more broader sense as well. How strong are protests, and when does the left want to be utilizing protests?
Yeah. I think, well, let me just say something about the particular situation that passage that you read was responding to. There was a lot of criticism, and then I'll use that to jump to the bigger question.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of criticism, in November of 2019, right, of the left congressional figures that signed on to this agreement, right, that opened the way for the plebiscite, firstly, and secondly, the constituent elections, and now the assembly. Because there was this sense that mobilization and protest on the street was so strong and so disruptive. And it was. There's no doubt about that. That's the only reason we got this concession, right? Because of the cost imposed by the disruption on the street, the disruption in neighborhoods, the disruption to the economy that this rebellion imposed. But there was the sense that that type of mobilization alone could have continued and accomplished bringing down the regime. The Frente Amplio Congress people who signed on were accused of saving Piñera's ass because he was about to fall, right? And we should have let the revolution occur on the street. The fact is, perhaps because they were so strong, because the rebellion, this mass insurgency was so powerful and it had rocked the government so dramatically, it probably could have brought down Piñera, right? But then what? It would not have had the wherewithal, right, to take over, to topple the entire regime and build a new one, right? And that's where the limit, unless you're striving for a Bolshevik type takeover and revolution, which I think is off the agenda for a number of reasons, right? That's where the weakness of that type of approach, I think, is most notable. Instead, what I think movements need, and this is what has occurred, not as strongly as perhaps we'd like, but this is what's happening in Chile right now. Instead, what we need to do is find some kind of transmission mechanisms from mass social movements and mobilization on the street, right, to the levers of power, to state institutions, right, so that that mobilization, that disruption coming from below can actually translate into institutional change, institutional transformation. And that is exactly what the movement achieved in Chile through that agreement, through that concession by the state, right, or from the state. And so one of the, I think, ways of using this insight, if you find it to be insightful, that is, right, is to now look at the situation, you know, in the assembly. There's a lot of praise and celebration for these independent lists, right, because they represent the grassroots, the more autonomous networks of community movements and social movements, right, and they will be the ones who will be able to refound the Chilean democracy, right? I'm somewhat skeptical of that. If these independent, quote unquote, independent movements, right, and their grassroots affiliates and organizations don't find ways to team up, right, with more organized parties and institutions that have programmatic and strategic vision and discipline, right? I fear that all that energy, all that potential might be lost. Just to give you a slight taste of this, a sense of this, right? These independent lists in Chile, right? It wasn't just one standard across the board from north to south slate, right? It was really fragmented throughout. And as a result, because they couldn't coordinate a single slate, much less coordinate with this new left slate, right? As a result, about 10% of the vote was just squandered. And we could have had an additional 10% of the delegates on our side had there been better coordination with these quote unquote independence, grassroots, social movement forces. And I think we can project the same kind of concern moving forward in terms of the role they might play and how they might better articulate with partisan forces.
I want to ask about the Frente Amplio and just kind of like what's their deal? Like, what kind of party is it? Like, what are the differences between them and the Communist Party? Like, you know, if I'm some Chilean guy and I'm sampling the parties, what would make me join the Frente Amplio over the Communist Party or vice versa? Are they like a Podemos or in Spain, or what's their deal?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first of all, I'm really happy that they've come together and they you know, in this alliance with the communists, because there seem to be these two kind of distinct paths that had too many differences to come together. So it's for Chilean politics and for the prospects of democratizing Chilean society, right, and for, you know, social justice outcomes. It's really, really a great development that the Frente Amplio has joined the communists and coalition. But, you know, who or what is the Frente Amplio? Frente Amplio really grew out of primarily the mass student mobilizations of 2011, 2012. You know, those were the first huge, you know, mass protest that rocked the post-authoritarian regime in Chile, and it spawned, right, new organizations, new political figures, and the elections that followed in 2013 saw a few of them elected to Congress, somehow breaking through this duopoly, right? That's actually that's enshrined in Pinochet's 1980 constitution, because it pretty much reserves all representation for the top two forces per district, right? But these new movements and their leaders had such an impact through those mobilizations that a few of them broke through. Some were communist, some were not communist. Some they described themselves as autonomist or Gramscian, all kinds of stuff, right? But they said we won't.
Pete
Unlike
Buttigieg's dad.
what's that?
He's Pete Buttigieg's dad is one of the leaders. He's the yeah.
Well, yeah. The difference is that these guys actually were part of a mass movement, right, on the street. But so when these new young leaders were elected to Congress, the communists, and there are a couple of communists among them, decided to make an alliance with the center left. What, in my view, what really distinguishes the Frente Amplio, besides the fact that they emerged from these new mass protests, is that they were completely opposed to not just the right and center right, but the center left as well, because they correctly saw them as the managers of Chilean neoliberalism, right? And so they preserved that independence and kept building their organizations. From student organizations, they went on to have influence in teachers' unions. From there into other sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So that by the 2017 elections, right? And this is, again, a force that had just come together as a formal alliance in 2014. By 2017, they won 20% of the first round vote in the presidential elections, right? So they kind of established themselves as a new left in Chile. To be distinguished from the old hard, if you want to say hard left, to differentiate from the center left, right, which were the communists, right? Communists by then had lost its mass base that it historically had in Chile's working class, because it had been marginalized from the transition process and from these negotiations. It had really become a force, an extremely weak force in Chilean politics. They experienced a revitalization both through their participation in the mass student movement, but then through some local victories, primarily Daniel Jadwe's victory in one of the Santiago townships in Recoleta. And he's done quite well. And so that has bolstered communist credibility, because he's governed in very pragmatic ways, but delivered some real reforms for poor and working people in Recoleta. And so then they come together, and not all, but many of the Chileans who have, of course, come to reject the old regime, and by that rejecting both the center left and the center right, see in this new alliance as a viable formation that can move things forward.
Well, so my last question is actually harkens back to that old hard left, because as you've written, the social base for kind of the classic left in Latin America, much like the left around the world, was historically working class, industrial, and manufacturing. Not everywhere exactly the same, but that's typically kind of been concentrated workers, somewhat skilled, that have a good deal of structural leverage in the economy, that they're important for the process of corporations and capitalists making profits, so that when they do fight back, the punch hits that much harder. And the thing is that, as you know very well, because I'm about to put up a figure from one of your pieces, so much of employment across Latin America is informal work, meaning it's not the standard contract between a worker and a boss that maybe it's more typical, although becoming a little bit less so in the global north. But across the continent, you have these very high levels of workers who are, it's some form of part-time work, or it's like what we know as gig work. It might just be kind of making ends meet in their particular communities. And I mean, one of the things that's obviously very shocking about this graphic, which is actually from a different piece that you wrote, is kind of how flat so many of these lines are across the continent, despite the amount of political change that's happened over the last several decades. But at the very bottom, with those triangles is Chile. That Chile has among the lowest levels of informality, or informal work rather, on the continent. And so, thinking ahead of the outcome of the plebiscite, of a left being renewed in Chile or across the continent. I mean, there's massive transformations happening across the continent right now. How should we understand the actual social base of a left-wing project going forward? And to what extent does that kind of give us indicators of how successful these efforts might end up being?
Yeah, to me, this is the key question, right? For the future, not just of the left in Latin America, but for politics and development more generally in the region. This, in my opinion, is the core handicap of the left right now in the region, that its key constituencies, right, that it relies on, that it mobilizes, or that mobilize, on their own, have come from the most peripheral, most marginal sections of the working class, mainly the informal sector, right? And for instance, in the pink tide countries, those left governments that emerged in the early 2000s into the mid 2000s, right? Their main bases of support were informal sector workers and communities, right? And they did propel them to power, and they did bring down old government, neoliberal governments, right? The problem, as you pointed out, Kale, is that while they might be able to forge new organizations and coordinate fairly massive mobilizations, they lack the kind of leverage that the old constituencies of the left used to have, in which they used to deploy, right, in order to really put a strain on the system, right, to really, really impose costly disruptions on the system. And that, what we call structural leverage, was rooted in their position in the industries that elites valued the most. Well, if your backers now are working in food stands, or somehow in gigs, freelancing from day to day, right? First of all, they're not working in industries that, if they somehow find ways to disrupt them, will really hit elite interests hard. If you decide one day not to show up to your sandwich stand, elites aren't going to really care. It's not imposing, cost on them. And on top of that, this is the most atomized, the most scattered, right? These are the most atomized, the most scattered portions of the working class. You're working on your own, getting by on your own. It's a hyper-competitive environment just to survive. So it's hard to, forge these bonds with like-minded people and communities, right? And come together around a shared project. And this is the challenge that the left in Latin America, and I guess the world over, has to somehow overcome. The left shouldn't reject, of course, right, the involvement, participation of informal workers, especially if they're rebelling. I mean, how would we reject that? That's what happened in Chile in October 2019, right? It accomplished quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But we have to go beyond that and find ways to organize sectors of the working class that do, because of where they work, the sectors they work in, their job sites, have this built-in ability to disrupt elites and their profits and their interests, right? The figures that you showed there, in terms of the Chilean scenario, are a bit too optimistic. Later on in that very, very long essay, I show that more accurately about 40% of Chileans, 40 to 45%, toil in the informal sector, right? And that means that most of Chilean workers are scattered throughout society and the economy. And we have to find, branches of industry, geographic locations right, where there are larger concentrations of workers, right, who work in key nodes of the economy, where if they stop working, right, they can really, really hit business profits hard. And I think Chile does offer some promising prospects. Along with the rise of mass protest, this renewed cycle of mobilization that started around 2010, right? There has also been a revitalized labor insurgency. It's been patchy, uneven, right? But thankfully, it's also happened in key sectors of the Chilean economy. In mining, for instance, Chile is a country that continues to depend on natural resources, primarily on copper and copper exports, right? Well, there has been some new organizing and rebellions in copper since then. In the ports, I mean, after you dig up the mineral, the copper, you've got to ship them to ports, and from there, transport them out to the world, to China, the US, what have you, right? Well, there have been very, very powerful dock worker campaigns, organizing campaigns and strikes over the last 5 or 6 years, right? And so what I think the new left, the new partisan left, and thankfully it is consolidating itself. It has established itself in this new alliance between the communists and the Frente Amplio. What it has to do is find ways to go beyond the layers it already works with, students, impoverished professionals, or whatever you want to call them, middle class, urban sectors, and find ways to connect to these newly rebelling working class sectors that have this kind of structural leverage. One of the implications of that is that, when it comes to, for instance, thinking about the role that these independents, both the independent delegates in the constituent assemblies and these independent, autonomous, horizontalist, more, networks and movements on the ground, when it comes to thinking of the role they'll play, right? We have to really pose this question and think about it hard. Are they the sectors that are going to get us over the hump? Surely they have a lot to contribute. But as you mentioned earlier, Kale, do these middle-class women again, they've been great in mobilizing this way, right? Millions of people on the street, and they can paralyze the capital in a day. Mm-hmm. Or do these retired workers who are just barely scraping by, no longer working in industry, by definition, they're retired, right? But they mobilize 1.5 million people in their biggest demonstrations as well, right? Will these be the sectors that will really be able to confront any resistance by the old neoliberal elites, right? When it comes to legislating universalist reforms, like, a public healthcare system, like real public universal education for all, including for the children of the poor, et cetera, et cetera. Will they be the ones that will be able to, band with us and push that through? We'll have to see. What we do know is that if this new partisan left, which again is strong in one sense, it has occupied some institutional positions, and that's really important, but is weak in another sense. It lacks these deeply rooted constituencies, right, in the working class. Will they be able to really push hard and face the resistance of both the Concertación neoliberal elites and the new right? By the way, I say new right because the right is reinventing itself right now, trying to. Mm-hmm. Will they be able to without relying on that structural power of these newly rebelling sectors of the working class? I'm pretty skeptical about it.
Right. It's kind of the double bind that we have in the U.S. as well right now, where it's to revitalize the left, you probably need something like an industrial policy. And in order to implement an industrial policy, you probably need to have the left in power. And it's the same thing in the U.S. here. We've been talking about with like the PRO Act. To pass the PRO Act, you would probably need to have a revitalized labor movement. To have a revitalized labor movement, you probably need to rip apart so much of the draconian labor law that we have on the books right now.
Yeah, no, but again, the difference is we won a constituent assembly. So that can be written into the new constitution,
Hmm.
right? Labor rights. Chile is so backward when it comes to, and so pro-employer when it comes to labor legislation and labor law, right? Well, this is why winning the plebiscite, winning the assembly, electing a new lefty really, really matters, because precisely because, you know, we can now shift the balance, as it were, at workplaces in ways that allow rebelling workers to organize much more effectively and then deploy, right, this potential power that they have. It's going to be tough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's on the agenda for the first time in you know, over in about 50 years.
Wow. All right. Well, René Rojas, thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating. You know, it's hard to find windows of opportunity for the left around the world these days. This certainly seems like a very big one, and we'll definitely be watching it as it unfolds. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It's good talking to you.
Thanks, René. Wonderful.
Chile, dude.
Yeah. It's like I said at the top, I mean, just like the contrast between like what we deal with just like kind of the horrific like woke middle class like politics driving everything in the US, it seems, and then like this massive transformation of the country that like is actually coming from, you know, working people from below. It's optimistic, at least.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it's, you know, Chile is an interesting place. I think Chile is the most unequal country in the OECD. I remember hearing that stat for a long time when people were like, that was like the repost to like, oh, look at Chile, it's amazing, you know, like everything works. And the president himself is a billionaire. Sebastián Piñera is a billionaire. Like this is what I'm like kind of looking to see is like, you know, how is the you know, the 1% class, they're not gonna like just take this lying down. Like they're gonna do something. You know, there's gonna be some sort of counterattack. So it'll be interesting to see. We got the Chilean constitution process. We got the Brazilian elections coming up. It's interesting times in Latin America.
Fun times.
Fun times, baby.
This would be typically where I would come on screen for the first time to do super chat questions with you, our lovely audience, but we're not live. I don't know if we said that at the top.
We didn't.
No, we're not live, so we can't actually take your super chat questions, but you should still send them if you can. I'll
answer them via email like Noam Chomsky.
That's right. We'll do that. But we could ask. I could just assume the questions you're sending us right now. Again, I can't actually see them. You're in the future, and I'm not.
Yeah,
but
pre-tape call-in show. You're doing the bit. I know you're doing the bit.
Yeah, I wish we should do some more tape call-in bits.
Maybe we should do a call-in feature. You know, but like people can send like voice notes and we can answer their questions. That'd be kind of fun.
All right, let's do it. Send them to editor@jacobinmag.com.
There you go. Send your voice notes.
Yeah, send some voicemails. We'll answer them.
Speaking of Latin America, Latin Americans be loving voice notes. You know, they're WhatsApping voice notes to each other all day. It's like this weird thing. You know, Americans don't do it. But Latin Americans, like they're just like in WhatsApp chats, just sending voice notes to each other all day.
They're an advanced people. They get it.
All right. Well, should we wrap, Young Kale?
Yeah, I think we should. I don't have any questions.
That's a good place to wrap. Yeah, we don't have any questions. We're in the past.
Yeah. How's your dog? I guess I'm assuming someone should send us a super chat question asking how Nando's dog is doing. So
dog is great.
Okay.
Dog is lovely. I love the dog. Dog is the light of my life.
Wonderful. Thanks for that question.
Person in the future. All right, guys. Well, have a good Memorial Day weekend. You know, I guess it's for the troops. Memorial Day is for the troops, right?
Yes,
I think it is. Yeah. We're such classic lefties. We don't even know. Yeah, happy Memorial Day. Enjoy your hot dogs. Enjoy your burgers.
Go to the
Don't get
beach.
too drunk. Go to the beach. Enjoy the sunshine. It's beautiful here in California. I don't know how it is over there, Kale, but
It's horrible.
beautiful here. It's horrible. Okay, great. Happy Memorial Day, and see you next weekend.
Bye, everyone.